Hi everyone, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Charlotte. Like Charlotte said, my name is Elizabeth Couse and I am an environmental activist. I am a farmer, chef, permaculture teacher. I'm really passionate about all things connecting to the land and creating abundant ecosystems that include humans as a part of them. And like she mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about decolonizing permaculture, which is a really important topic, I think, and I'm really grateful that Envision is giving the space for hard conversations like this. And I'm going to start with a little bit of my personal story of getting into the permaculture movement, as I think it's really relevant to how I kind of came to being involved in this specifically. So when I was a teenager, I was really passionate about a lot of things. I was this super fiery kid in high school, and I really wanted to help the world, and I wanted to go into some kind of humanitarian work. And I ended up studying agriculture and development in university. And in one of my first classes, all freshmen in my program had to take a class called Intro to Sustainable Agriculture. And my professor was going through this slideshow, and he was talking about soil health and ecology and the organic food movement in the US, and specifically a lot on USDA organic certification. And he was kind of rushing to finish up the lecture as it was about to be over. And there was one slide at the end, and it just said Beyond Organic, and it had 2 bullet points. And it said regenerative agriculture and permaculture. And he was finishing through and he was just like, yeah, there's a few other movements that go kind of one step beyond organic, and they're trying to really regenerate ecosystems, and they're even a little bit better than organic. And I remember thinking, like, if there's something that's even better than organic, why wouldn't we be doing the absolute most possible? And I think that day was the first time I consciously heard the word permaculture, and it became kind of solidified in my mind. And that's what kind of began my permaculture journey. And I came to Costa Rica the first time in university as well, working with farmers in the Central Valley. And I ended up in an amazing Costa Rican family-owned permaculture project here. It's called Vías Más Total. And then some years later, I came back to Costa Rica and I did my permaculture design course at a center called Finca Tierra in the Caribbean. And it's a really amazing permaculture project run by a couple. And the wife is named Ana Gaspar, and she's Costa Rican. And prior to starting the center, she was a lawyer, and she actually, for about a decade, was a legal advisor for indigenous rights in Costa Rican Congress. So she spent a decade traveling around Costa Rica, spending time with different indigenous communities here and working with them. And when her and her husband decided to start the project, they basically went back around to all the communities she had spent time with and all the friends and connections she had made, and she learned from them, and they collected seeds and plants and brought them back to the farm. And their course is really special in that they put a really big focus on indigenous cosmovision and indigenous rights. And in their course, they actually have a friend of theirs who's part of the Quebecar tribe, which is one of the dominant tribes in Talamanca. And in short, to say, I had this really beautiful, amazing introduction into the permaculture space, and I ended up moving back to Costa Rica full-time after I graduated and stepping up more into a teaching and facilitating role. And it wasn't until a few years after this, I was really deep in the permaculture space, that I saw a talk and heard a quote by a woman named Leah Penniman. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with her. But she started a project in the northeast of the US called Soulfire Farm, and it's an anti-racism farm specifically targeted at youth. And she also published a book called Farming While Black, and she works a lot with unpacking racism in the food system. And I really respect and value what she has to say, and I'm going to read you the quote of the speech that she said. So she said, "To say an unpopular thing, permaculture isn't really real. Permaculture is the amalgamation of a number of indigenous agroecology technologies that have been rebranded, packaged, and sold, mostly by college-educated white men to turn a profit on their courses. But the actual techniques that they have rebranded as permaculture do exist, and I think it's so important for us to honor the source of each of them by learning about the history, naming them, and if we're going to pay royalties to anyone, to pay royalties to those indigenous people who created the technologies." And yeah, her words really hit me hard because on one end, about 90% of it I resonated with, and I was like, what? It was this huge wake-up call. I was like, I respect her so much and what she has to say. I was like, is permaculture really just this white dude movement for privileged people? Like, I had kind of this really different introduction and experience in the movement. And so it led me to start questioning things, and I was still really deep in the permaculture movement, especially in Costa Rica, and that was the first thing that just kind of had me thinking in a more critical way about permaculture. And I continued on with life and everything, but as time went on, I kept seeing more and more critiques of permaculture and noticing things myself, especially with my experience in Costa Rica, and I saw a lot more, especially BIPOC activists and people really critiquing permaculture. And it was hard for me because I had this like internal battle in that my experience, especially with the permaculture design course, but in the permaculture world in general, was so beautiful. And I've seen it change the lives of so many people and be so transformational for every person who comes through. And I also felt like I had these really beautiful experiences, especially at the first place that I did my PDC, of having indigenous knowledge and indigenous cosmovision really be at the forefront of what they were teaching. But as I spent more time here, I was seeing more examples of, yeah, this exactly what Leah was saying, this kind of white man-led movement that was really based in ego. I was seeing a lot of examples of, I don't know, I would go on YouTube and see things that would say, growing all my own food for a year and living off-grid in a tiny cabin, I'm saving the world. And it was just a little bit interesting because I feel like I would also drive around Costa Rica and I would see all these campesinos and subsistence farmers who are doing the exact same thing, and I felt like there was just this big imbalance in who was getting attention within the movement. And like Charlotte was saying, unfortunately, a lot of permaculture projects also doing things like literally buying stolen indigenous land, cutting down trees, and et cetera, et cetera. And so it just brought me to this point where eventually it was kind of building up, and I kind of had to decide, and I was having this dilemma of like, I didn't know if I wanted to be associated with the permaculture movement anymore. That's kind of how negatively I was seeing it. But again, I just kept being brought back, and I kept, especially in the permaculture design course and helping to facilitate them and teach them, seeing like the beauty in them and the beauty that every student brought through and how empowering they really are. So it kind of brought me to a point where I had a decision of, I was like, I can either do something to change these negative or problematic things I see with the movement, or I can abandon it completely. And I decided to go with the first one. And so a few years ago, I helped to co-found a project called Liberation Permaculture. And it started as a conversation with some friends and colleagues here in Costa Rica just about these exact topics that I'm speaking on, whether it's the lack of diversity within the movement, the inaccessibility of the PDC often, with it being extremely expensive, issues of male teachers taking advantage of the power dynamics and sleeping with young female students, all these things. And we just started these conversations, and it ended up being about a year-long conversation of many hundreds of hours of Zoom calls, and it was really beautiful, and it happened really organically in that each person who was kind of involved in our project would just say, oh, I know this other person here who I know would really have a lot to say on this topic. And slowly we ended up forming a group of about 50 people from all over the world, from all walks of life, whether it was people in Northern California or indigenous people in India or people with a permaculture project in Zimbabwe, really from all over, taking part in this conversation of really unpacking a lot of the problems we have in the movement and trying to come up with solutions. I think permaculture, it's really about what we can do. It's not about everything that's wrong with the world. It's about how we can move forward. And I think we tried to use those exact same principles in how we were addressing this topic. And yeah, we ended up coming with 3 kind of publications. The first one was What is Permaculture? Because I think a huge thing to start with is there's a really big misunderstanding of what it actually is. It's this really aloof word where it doesn't even actually have a concrete definition, and people hear it and they might think it's gardening or compost toilets, but yeah, we wanted a really clear definition of what it was. And then we had Decolonizing Permaculture, where we outlined 5 key topics that we found to be problems that we see pretty consistently in patterns throughout the world within the movement. And then the final one was what is social permaculture, really putting a focus on the social aspect of it specifically. So I want to start first a little bit just talking about a little more about why I gravitated towards permaculture and kind of the social part in it. But first, I do want to get you guys involved a little bit. So can we just take a few minutes and maybe the person who's closest to you, I'm sorry if this is repetitive for anyone who's been at a lot of permaculture workshops, but I wanted to start with the question of what is permaculture? I'm sure it's a word that you guys have heard, especially around the festival a lot, but I want to get a really concrete understanding of the holistic aspect of it. So I'm just going to give you a few minutes, and then if a few people can share on just what do you think permaculture is?
Permaculture myself, I just got into it in the last year, and I'm practicing it, in my city. I have a little bit of land, so I dug it up, and I'm starting a garden and trying to weave a little bit of food sovereignty and kind of break away from the traditional food systems a little bit. So to me, it's just that, working with what we have and not creating more, for me, I guess, food, because I know that there's already like enough food in circulation to like feed the entire planet if it gets boosted. So for me, like permaculture is like using resources more wisely and recycling and reusing things. What about you?
I think it's derived from which in my mind is kind of the idea behind that word when the Wallace created it, that like sustainable in the extreme sense of permanence.
Okay.
I think it's a little bit, it's a little bit misleading term because nothing is permanent, the world is changing, the climate's shifting, humans have a long history of migrating based on changes.
Okay, if there's anyone who wants to share, I can come pass the mic.
I actually think
You know a lot about this.
I've done a lot of research. But
How
not
long have you been in? Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm like brand new in this.
She said regenerative style of life.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to share?
permanent agriculture.
Permanent agriculture? Yeah.
A term, yeah, it's also like a trademark like term by like someone's specific style.
He said it's a trademark term that someone specifically picked. Anyone else want to share?
Kind of part of the problem. It's basically
I just wanted to add that we don't think that permaculture is exactly a movement. It's mostly a series of principles for designing systems, but we don't think that permaculture is actually seeking to transform the society as a whole or the food systems. We think that designs are just transforming farms in that level, not in a more wide sense of the transformation.
That's really like
Thank you.
anything that sky development obviously not do a lot to
Check, check. Permaculture, from what I've seen, is obviously it has the branding and the ownership and the way it's put into books and courses. But the way that I interpret it is the umbrella of practices that people can use to live in a permanent culture, so that the land is not being depleted, but that the nutrients are staying with the land, that people are not wasting calories and are able to live with the land in a way that their homestead, their farm is permanently sustainable, and that nature is able to thrive.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Thank you. For me, permaculture is recognizing the patterns within nature and looking to weave ourselves into the patterns, because naturally diversity is the strongest we can be, and when we recognize that all the relationships together create a web of life, and if we can step back from being separated and for a second just to see those patterns, like that, for instance, nature doesn't have any waste, so how can we be zero waste? That would be.
Thank you. Maybe one last one here.
Yeah, permaculture seems to be a response to what's happened in our contemplative society lifestyle approach to designing things, to designing business, agricultural designs. We got real straight. I want that. This is how I'm going to get there fast. I'm going to get it. I'm going to try to use what I can to make my path quicker, and what I don't need to connect with isn't my business. And that has changed the way humans interacted and did life. And the founders of this movement, they saw that and said, well, what are the more contemplative ways to look at design? And so they did the research of the ancestors. And so permaculture is that. It's a way of taking all these design principles and process and looking at the whole playing field in a holistic way to contemplate how every step is affected and can benefit and be benefited from all the other things in the winding path to pleasantly get to where we want to go.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, everyone. So I think permaculture is a really unique and interesting concept and movement, especially in this time, is that it's a relatively young concept. So it was founded by two Australian men in the 70s, so it's only 50 years old. And I think it's really interesting because I think it asks of each of us to define permaculture in our own terms. And a friend of mine, his name is Adam Brock, he's a really amazing social permaculture teacher in the States. He calls it I think it's the founder syndrome of permaculture, really. So it's this design science that can really be applied to anything. And we often think of it in terms of landscape design and ecosystem design. But just as much as you can apply permaculture to a garden or a piece of land, you can apply it to social and emotional landscapes too. And permaculture is very anthropocentric. It's about us as Homo sapiens, and specifically the modern dominant culture that's really rooted in a lot of these broken systems like capitalism and white supremacy and so on. It's about how we return back in harmony and balance with the rest of nature. But yeah, a friend of mine, he calls it the founder's syndrome of, I think it's an interesting question to ask, can you separate the movement from the founders or the concept from the founders? And I think a lot of people would argue yes. I don't know if I've made up my mind about it, but the reality is that, yeah, it was started by two very privileged white men in Australia, and that's where the movement began and thrived, and for a long time there hasn't been a lot of diversity in it. And I think when you're creating something and adding to it, whether it's creating the permaculture design course or writing books about permaculture, if you're not hearing from diverse voices, like, you're inherently missing something. If you're not hearing from marginalized people, if you're not hearing from Black and Indigenous and people of color and women when talking about permaculture and defining it and creating all this literature about it and courses, I just think inherently you're leaving big parts out. And the thing is, all of us, we're trying to create this utopian society without all of these broken systems that I mentioned. But a big pattern that I see here, especially in Costa Rica, you see a lot of eco-communities and eco-villages, and majority of them fail in the end. I think it's around 90% of eco-villages that start fail within the first 5 years. And it's never because the tomatoes didn't grow. That's not the reason why permaculture projects and eco-villages fail. It's because we're not able to get along with each other. And that's why I think the social aspect of it is so important. And again, what drew me to permaculture. And when we're talking about getting the dominant modern culture back in harmony with the rest of nature, like, it has to be about the social parts of it too. Like, we have the answers to regenerate the earth and draw down carbon back into the soil, but the fact that we're not able to get along with each other and there's so much inequality and injustice, that's what's really preventing us from actually creating that utopian world that we all really want. So yeah, a lot of people think permaculture is just gardening. There's a quote, pardon, I forget the man's name, but he says that permaculture without class struggle is just gardening. It's so much more than that. That's why I think anti-racism work is just as big a part of permaculture as composting is, as is women's rights and decolonization and so on. So yeah, I just encourage you all, if anything you take away, permaculture is really this holistic movement that's not just about the land, it's also really about how we relate to each other and about justice. So I want to go a little bit into the 5 themes that the group that we came up with in relation to decolonizing permaculture. So the first one, and like Leah Penniman said in that first quote, it's about appropriation and true origins. So it is true that the 2 founders, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, it was a professor and his student. Those were the founders of permaculture. And they traveled around Australia and spent time with different Aboriginal groups, the Indigenous people of Australia, learning from them. And that was their biggest inspiration. They, of course, pulled from other ideas, whether it was traditional agriculture in other societies and modern science and etc. But I do think it's worth noting, and I think that every permaculture project, like no matter what, needs to really like name and honor and have in deep reverence the people who have stewarded the land and kept up with these techniques that have like kept the earth viable to get us to where we are now. And one of the parts of the project is we really all had a deep commitment to like naming and honoring certain practices to the people who they're associated with when we hear them, and also really like financially compensating Indigenous people in traditional ways of life whenever we can. So whether that's incorporating them in a permaculture course if they want to share and be a part of it, donating parts of the profits that you make from permaculture projects to Indigenous groups, I think it's really, really, really important. And the second theme that we outlined is diversity. We often talk about monocultures in relation to farming, but we don't often talk about that in groups of people. And that was something that I definitely saw in the permaculture world, especially in Costa Rica, it can be very homogenous. A lot of permaculture courses are just foreigners, just white people, just people from the Western world, and there's a real lack of diversity. And it's not to say that there aren't amazing people all over the world in the permaculture movement, but I think a lot of it speaks to who we give the space for. When you think of the permaculture projects in Costa Rica that are the most successful, I guarantee most of them are owned by foreigners, and specifically white American men. But there are so many amazing Costa Rican permaculture projects and teachers, some at this festival here. There's a Costa Rican permaculture network called the Red Permanesca, and there's so many amazing projects here. And so I think it's a challenge to each of us to look at who the people we give attention to in the patterns of, oh, maybe we're more comfortable hearing from someone who's from where we're from, or English is their first language, or whatever it is, but really honoring the diversity within the movement and realizing that there are people from all walks of life teaching permaculture and writing books about it. And also specifically when in the PDC and a lot of spaces, I think just encouraging more diversity in that way as well. And then another theme that we looked at was the PDC. So I don't know if all of you are familiar, the permaculture design course is a 72-hour course that many different projects and people teach all over the world. And the way that it's currently taught is it's often 2 weeks, and it's usually thousands of dollars. And I get that the thing is, it's kind of this dilemma in that all of us, whether we're teaching permaculture or whatever, we have to fit in the confines of these broken systems too, right? So we have to survive capitalism while also trying to create an abundant solidarity economy. So I get that we all have to make money and a livelihood, but I think putting more initiatives out that really try to make it more accessible and affordable, trying to reach more marginalized communities. You know, I think there won't really be any kind of permaculture revolution until the most marginalized people of society have access to it. And yeah, just really reimagining the permaculture design course, I think, is a really important part of it, because at the current moment, unfortunately, a lot of permaculture knowledge is really siloed just for the most privileged people in society. A lot of permaculture books and education is only in English, so I think encouraging and putting more efforts and supporting projects that work to bring it to other people is really important as well. And then another theme that we talked about is white saviorism, or often called green missionary work. I'm never trying to push permaculture down anyone's throat. Like, I think any ways that people today can feel connected to the earth and feel passionate about connecting with the land and with each other and fighting for this more beautiful world we know is possible. Like, I want you to find that, whether it's permaculture, whether it's regenerative agriculture, agroecology, solidarity economies, any different thing. Like, it doesn't have to be permaculture. And I think the humility aspect in the movement is really important. One of the principles in permaculture is slow and small solutions. And just like in nature, like, usually change doesn't happen overnight, and I don't think any of us need to feel like we can save the whole world overnight either. And there are a lot of permaculture teachers, unfortunately, in places like Africa, really using it as this thing, saying, I'm gonna change these people's lives and bring them all these wonderful things through permaculture. And I think just, again, having deep respect and reverence for people care and for cultural sensitivity, and for people who are already in a place, and asking, what do they really want, knowing that community leaders are always going to know what's best for their community more than any outsider first, and just really upholding that. And then the last theme that we dived into was about land ownership. And I think this one's a really tricky one, because again, we're all working in the confines of the modern society that we live in, where you kind of usually, to have any kind of security, need to have a land title and own land. But what does that really mean? What are the ethics of buying land, especially in Costa Rica, when it's often a lot of foreigners coming here who automatically, no matter who you are, if you come from the States or Europe and you're coming here, like, you have privilege, you have a passport that gets you into this country, you have access to financial loans, and the fact that, again, a lot of permaculture education is going to be in a language that you speak. Like, there's so much privilege that comes with that. And I think encouraging, especially within the PDC, but otherwise encouraging questioning people and challenging people as to what it means to own land, and really, I think seeing that is a really, a lifelong thing, not just something you come visit here for a week and decide you want to buy land, but really understanding what it means to become part of an ecosystem and a community in that kind of way. And yeah, we published these 3 things, and we got amazing feedback from people all over the world. It really resonated with a lot of people. And now the project Liberation Permaculture, we're still just doing a lot of work to kind of promote justice and equality within the permaculture movement. And like one of the women over here said, I do think there's a difference between the concept and the movement. So permaculture is a concept. It's all about kind of re-indigenization. It's all about, how do we become native to the land again? How do we move away from these colonial white supremacist systems and all of that? But then there's also the fact that it is a movement made up from people who are predominantly from the dominant culture, who were still raised under patriarchy and white supremacy and all these things. And we all have to uncondition ourselves from them. And I think we have to design in place knowing that those conditioning and biases are all there. So yeah, I just think it's really important, especially at a festival like this, recognizing that a lot of us are really excited about permaculture, and I think that's amazing. And I encourage all of you to take a permaculture design course if you can. They're really life-changing and transformational, but just also really keeping that in the back of your mind, that it's this really holistic design. It's not just about the land and farming. It's about people care too, and wherever we are, especially as visitors in this country, we really have to have deep respect and reverence for the people here first. Yeah, thank you, and I am going to now open it up to questions, if anyone has any questions. I'm actually part of a panel this afternoon called Cultural Integration, and it's a mix of Ticos or Costa Ricans and also foreigners who lived here for a while. and we're going to be talking all about this exact topic of what it really means to actually assimilate and integrate into a foreign place. But I think the first thing to ask is, you know, a lot of people come to Costa Rica for the first time and they're so amazed by the nature and, you know, this real paradise, and it can often really be rooted on how this place benefits them. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that at the first glance, but I think if you're really thinking about moving here and creating a home here, you also have to ask, like, how can you give back to this place? You know, a lot of ecological design is really about relationships, and how can you have a relationship to the land or a relationship with the community if it's this one-way benefit? So not only, like, how does this place that's such a paradise and so beautiful, how does it support your dreams, but also how do you, or in what ways does the community here actually want you to be part of it? How can you give back? In what ways do the local people around you, like, how do you relate to them? I think that's a really big part of it. So.
Hi. I was gonna ask about, I feel like there's a lot of talk about like moving to Costa Rica and starting utopia, but like what are some resources for integrating some of these resources like into where you're already at? Like, and that we're doing it in a more accessible way, that like you don't have to like leave your country and start something new. Like how can you integrate more just where you already are?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important first question, bouncing off the first one as well, is asking, you know, do you really need to live here to have your dream life? This is a beautiful place, and I feel very lucky to have made a home here, but it's definitely not for everyone, and I think there's a real beauty in also making change in where you're from, and I know that for a lot of people, places like the US and Europe and their home countries can feel really toxic and really rough, but we can't abandon those places also, and they're also not separated from us. Like, we're all interconnected, so as long as there's suffering and imbalances and environmental degradation there, like, they affect us as well. So I think keeping in mind, like, it's kind of a personal thing, but are you willing to make the change in your home first? And really, a dream permaculture life doesn't have to mean some bamboo cabin with banana trees growing behind it. You know, you can practice permaculture if you live in a city. I think someone here actually is doing an urban permaculture talk, but you can incorporate permaculture design and permaculture principles absolutely anywhere. And so just starting with that first, where you are in your home.
It's me again. I actually am part of the panel of cultural integration today at 2:45. Yeah, you are invited to. But I am not keeping this question for later because it's more of this topic, and I'm really curious about what do you think about agroecology. I am agroecologist, and I am part of the scientific Latin American Scientific Society of Agroecology, and I think social permaculture sounds to me like agroecology, actually, but agroecology was created in Latin America and was created by us here. It's a science, it's a political movement, and it's a practice. And I really admire permaculture, but I feel more comfortable with agroecology because it's founded by us, it's built by us, and it really aims to transform society, and it really does that. I'm really curious about what do you think about that, and why do you think there is no much dialogue between the two movements, and how do you think we can collaborate, because at the end we have the same goals, and I would like to see more collaboration in the future between these two movements. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I'll start with the first part of it, bouncing off. I really don't think anyone can gatekeep how someone connects to the earth and how they feel passion to make the world a better place. So whether it's agroecology or permaculture or regenerative agriculture, I think they're all amazing movements, and they're not in competition with each other. I think they all beautifully walk hand in hand in what it means to create this abundant future that we all want. So yeah, whichever movement resonates with you, I think that's totally fine. And yeah, no one, like I said, I'm never pushing permaculture down anyone's throat. I don't think it's for everyone, and it's really about just which thing, you know, speaks to your heart. As far as collaboration, I do think there's actually quite a lot of overlap between the two movements, but my personal experience is I find agroecology to be a little bit more science-based, and that's something that I studied about a lot in school, where the social part of it I just am not as familiar with, which is why permaculture is what drew me originally. And I also think the fact that there is the 2-week PDC, which is this really beautiful foundation where you get really clearly all the foundations of permaculture, all, you know, in one place really clearly. That for me was also the most helpful, where agroecology, of course you can learn about it and there are resources, but there's not this one standardized course that gives you all the information. But I hope that answers your question.
Thanks for holding the space here and bringing the thing. It's a topic that I actually recently had a group conversation with a bunch of people and preparing a bilingual follow-up. And the topic, interestingly, is cultural bridging as a remedy for neocolonialism. And in the group discussion that we had, there was actually some of the TICO presenters that I had speak at this event. They brought it up, and like neocolonialism really isn't about race or nationalism or sexism or anything. It's a mindset. And they brought in how much colonialism they see around them in San Jose with the Tico population. It's the colonialism is a mindset of, I have the resources or the guns and I'm going to do what I want here. And without connection, without bridging the culture, finding out, observing, right? And I think that's something with the colonialist aspect of permaculture that is seen and that you pointed to is sometimes people come in and put in their big project and don't do the neighbor check-in. But this is something that transcends all of the other things. Even at this very festival, some of the producers here are women with a colonialist mindset. It exists. So I think really what you're saying about cultural bridging is a key piece because, and it's language. Bueno, esta reunión que quiero tener en Zoom, voy a tener a alguien para traducir todo, para todos en inglés y español, que todos los que están ahí pueden tener la misma conversación juntos and talk about whatever we all need to realize we got to talk about to come up with these solutions together. I would also say the eco-village thing, it's not really necessarily some US white man thing. Like if you go to ecovillage.org, I forget, the sister organization CASA is thriving. CASA is Latin American eco-villages, and it's impressive. They are tight. They are taking permaculture and all of this movement in the hands of women, Latinos, etc., etc. So I just want to speak to that. While the websites that we often find that have a price tag for an experience where you pay to come and get hosted and fed and taken care of and feel safe for 2 weeks in somebody's home, they have a price tag, and many times it's some person from a northern country that has started it. But I would say in my 13 years here in Costa Rica, I think there's a lot of really amazing things happening with the Tico population, and just with the Latino population. There's a lot of people from Argentina here that are doing good works, and etc. I just want to add that to the thing that I think the conversation can be moved to the mindset of coming in and doing what we want to do without thinking about the whole, and how we can feel that in every single one of us.
Yeah, thank you. I want to say if it didn't come through clearly when I was speaking before, I just want to say no. There's absolutely so many amazing minority groups here practicing permaculture, putting together amazing courses, whether it's Costa Ricans or otherwise, or women or indigenous people. The point was more that we often give more space and more attention to the white American gringo movements and more questioning like why is that? I think for most people, if you think of most of the most popular permaculture centers here or permaculture teachers, you're going to think of movements that are all started by American people or all started by men. And no, it's absolutely not to say there's so many amazing Latino permaculture projects. So it's really just encouraging all of you to also give attention to them and ask why, why aren't they as popular as the ones owned by Americans?
I just remembered one more quick thing I wanted to share. Permaculture is free. You can Google free permaculture courses in a variety of languages and get schooled. There are video recordings of permaculture courses you can get for $70 and get every moment of that experience without having to be hosted and fed and all the things that raise the price of a permaculture course. So I just want to encourage anybody that feels alienated from permaculture to just do self-education. There's all of the information and the practice. Like this brother right here, he's teaching permaculture with every breath he takes. Everybody that knows Wampa knows something about this kind of contemplative living. And he teaches it. People come and he teaches them how to tend to the earth and things. And he does it for free or for a humble price. And there are a gratefully grand number of Wampas in this country and around the planet. So if your heart's for permaculture and you don't got the dollar to drop, just Google it.
Before the next person, I just want to add to that quickly. I think when I first heard that quote from Leah Penniman and started to hear a lot of the critiques of permaculture, my first reaction was definitely defensiveness, because this is a movement that I've dedicated the last 8 years of my life to. I feel really passionately about it. And when all these people who I really respected, and especially, like I said, a lot of BIPOC people were really critiquing permaculture, my first response was to say, yeah, but it's not this, but there's that, and there's all these resources and X, Y, Z. But the reality is there are a lot of people out there and a lot of minority people and marginalized groups who don't feel that permaculture is for them, and there has to be a reason for that. It's not just random. And so again, I just think it's really important to, of course there's free permaculture resources, but we can always make it better, and there's always room for improvement. We can take one or two more questions. Yeah.
This isn't necessarily a question. So I 100% hear you. Some people don't have access to Wi-Fi. There's lots of barriers to entry to get into this space. Like she said, there may be situations where they don't feel comfortable, accepted, because they don't see faces like them represented at these conferences or in these spaces. So just because you can Google and have free like YouTube University courses, like you're saying, there's definitely room for improvement, and we can give much more space to the cultures and the indigenous people that actually develop these practices and like teach from that space and that voice. So that's my comment. It's not a question, so anyway,
Thank you. I think I saw one more hand over here. Any more questions? Questions?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, Aisha.
Hi. First, just thank you for this conversation, because I do think it was really needed. And me, as someone from the States who's been coming to Costa Rica for a few years and recently purchased land, want to be sensitive and respectful to the community that I've grown to love. And I am curious to know if you have any specific resources or programs or groups that are available to us, you know, foreigners who are building here respectfully?
Yeah, definitely. I'll touch on one thing quickly is when I first came to Costa Rica, when I moved here, I was 22, and for 22 years of my life, my main identity in the States was as a Chinese woman. And so I felt in a lot of ways like I was a minority. And coming here, just understanding that even though I might be a woman of color and be a woman, I have immense privilege here, and you can't deny that. And so I just think recognizing that privilege isn't inherently bad, like none of us asked to be born in the circumstances that we were in, but there's so much opportunity there, I think, to use that to do something good. And I'll just plug, because I don't want to be repetitive, this afternoon at 2:45 at this stage, we're doing a panel on cultural integration, and it's specifically about if anyone here is interested in moving to Costa Rica and relocating here, it's going to be a mix of Costa Rican people and foreigners, and on this very topic of integrating here, what it means, on gentrification, on topics like this. So I would really recommend coming back this afternoon for that talk. Cool.
Yeah, I had a similar question, but maybe just to open it up more globally. What are the most inspiring projects to you that are challenging class relations and property relations while doing ecologically regenerative production of human needs? Are there any things to look to that you find inspiration in?
Specifically in the permaculture world or anything? Anything. I don't know if I can think of a specific movement or group, but there's definitely projects in Costa Rica that stick out to me a lot. And the first one, if any of you are interested, is Finca Tierra. It's where I did my PDC, and it's run by a Costa Rican woman she's the one I said was the legal advisor for indigenous rights. And she's doing amazing work, and her PDC is amazing. It's in Puerto Viejo. That one is really cool. There's a group in Costa Rica called the Red Permanesco, which is a permaculture social network here. And I know a lot of groups in that are creating eco-villages and eco-communities of mostly Ticos and utilizing a lot of government resources. And I just think they know a lot more about it than a lot of us foreigners. And I know a lot of them are using it to their advantage to access land and things like that. But I don't know, unfortunately, I don't know if I have any specific projects that come to mind. Okay, I'm just gonna finish off by saying, one of the main principles in permaculture is use the edge and value the marginal. And I think, of course, like I was saying, it's really easy to see how permaculture can be applied to physical landscapes, but just as importantly, we have to apply it to social and emotional landscapes too. And I think when it comes to asking why is it that there's all these political and social barriers in place to us getting to this more beautiful world that we all want, we have to use these same principles that we use to design our garden to also organize ourselves. And I think the most marginalized people in the world have to be at the forefront of the permaculture movement for it to really be just and equitable for all. And I'll just say, if any of you are interested in learning more about this in this conversation on Instagram, you can go to @LiberationPermaculture, and there's quite a bit of resources there. And yeah, thank you all for your time, and anyone's welcome to ask me any questions after this as well. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for keeping it real, and coming up bullshit. Thank you. Thank you.